All right, today we're going to transition to talking about fuel systems. Now, fuel systems are something that's ubiquitous across all airplanes. They have to have it. And so there's commonalities. If you learn one fuel system, then you kind of start to learn the rest. The simplest fuel system that there is in the J Theory Cup. It's literally just a box with fuel in it that has like a little sight gauge, which is more or less just a clear tube that comes up that you can see as the level starts to drop, and then it goes off to your carburetor, and so that's really all there is to it. And that gets even like way more complicated whenever you get to heavy commercial aviation, like twin aisle jets, like a 777 or a 787 that have fuel heaters and multiple levels of redundancy and everything else. But in essence, it's all the same. Instead of having a little sight gauge, you're gonna have a digital readout. Instead of having a small silver pump that's mounted to the firewall, you have like really big pumps. But then there's other things that they add to it, like fuel heaters and so on and so forth. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the basics. We're going to very quickly sit with like reciprocating engines for just one lesson. We're gonna learn a system for us to kind of get familiar with. Then we're going to transition into the Learjet, where the majority of your classwork is going to focus on. And then once we go on from there, we will we'll start looking at the 737 MAX's fuel system and what does that look like, since that's the airframe that we've kind of chosen to try to like point you guys to. But yeah, so let's just start talking about components. We're going to start talking about just the general theory of it, and then we're going to break components one at a time. All right, so the most basic component that you'll have to contend with is just a fuel line. Now, you remember from general constructing lines, but let's just talk about like a couple of other little things about fuel lines that we need to be cognizant of as aircraft mechanics. Okay, so we won't rehash all of the details of building a line and things to look out for. You know to look out for chafing and make sure that it has the proper routing. That's probably honestly the biggest thing with fuel, is because between fuel and bleed air, that's where most of your fires are going to come from. And so like you have a chafed fuel line and then starts springing a leak, it might be slight enough to where you don't really register it on the fuel flow gauge or on your fuel pressure, but it's spraying fuel all over the place, and that becomes a major fire hazard. And it's just a matter of time before it ignites and keeps on going. So routing is really, really important. Just like you see here with like all the Adele clamps, and making sure that it's clear of anything that it could potentially rub on. Now, the other thing to think about is alignment of the fuel lines, making sure that as the line comes into the fitting, it marries up correctly, and it's not like cocked off on the side or coming through some sort of weirdo angle, because that will give you you'll be able to torque it, and you'll be able to say, okay, cool, yeah, that's good. But because it's sitting weird, the flange, if you imagine like this, is kind of like the male end of the fitting, and then the flange is going to sit, rather than sitting cupped up like that, it might sit cocked off to the side, where there's a little bit of a gap, causing a leak. And that leak might be so slight that you don't see it on a leak check. It doesn't have enough time to really kind of start to form and start to drip out. And so the alignment could be a sneaky one. So you want to make sure that it's lined up and it's taken care of. The next thing is bonding. Now, the preferred method of attaching a fuel line and anything is to have like a cushion Adele clamp, so that way it holds it off. But a lot of the heavy commercial aircraft are going to end up having fuel lines that are directly contacting aircraft structure. So you want to have a good, a very good super low ohm bond between the fuel line and the structure itself. So that way, whenever there's any static electricity that builds up in those fuel lines, it gets rid of it, and you don't have to worry about it building up a static charge and then jumping at some point, causing a spark, and then lighting a fire. The last one is clamping, and we're going to actually look at a graph. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't really know, but sometimes these fuel fittings will get fairly heavy, and they need extra support because the tubing itself isn't strong enough to actually keep that fuel fitting up and stable and not vibrating and all that good stuff. So any chance that the
fuel line could potentially sag over, especially over longer distances, we need to have support clamps on there. And then depending on the size of the line, will determine how often we should put these support clamps, these Adele clamps, whatever, what have you, across. So here's a table out of the AC43 where it basically says an 1/8 inch line to 3/16 should have supports every 9 inches of some variety if it's not clamped itself. 1/4 inch to 5/16 every 12 inches, so on and so forth. And what this will effectively do is create the I guess the effect of like that line was basically an integrated part of the structure, so that way it is super strong. Yeah, so that make sure you put your support clamps. All right. The other thing to remember is that whenever you are putting your clamps there, you're going to try to get them as close to the bend as possible in the line to prevent any sort of what they call overhang. Yeah, and you won't. And the reason being is that what you don't want to do is have a clamp in the middle of a line. It comes out to a bend and it goes another way, and then there's another one right there because all the vibration, all that good stuff is going to concentrate where those bends are at. Just like stress on in the versus like a square window versus a circular window, that kind of thing. And so the best thing to do is like anytime there's a bend, back off to where you're out of that bend just barely, and that's where you want to put your clamps at, if at all possible. Sometimes the environment won't allow that, but that's going to give that fuel line the most support possible.
All right, in order to get that fuel through that fuel line, we have to have some way to motivate the fuel, and therefore we're going to use a fuel pump. The fuel pump, it comes in all shapes and sizes and all levels of complexity, but that fuel pump is what moves the fuel through the fuel line.
Okay, so every aircraft is going to have some amalgamation of fuel pumps. Depends on what aircraft we're looking at as to what they're actually going to have. Now, generally speaking, this is going to get divided into two kind of fuel pump camps. One is going to be engine driven, and that's going to be meaning that it's attached to the engine. As the engine turns, it's going to turn the pump, and then it's going to pull fuel through the line. Now, those are almost like kind of those are like your primary pumps. So whenever you have, depending on the engine now, like you get into like Rotax and stuff like that, the pumps are going to be driven, which kind of just shows you the complexity of some of these systems. And it's all going to be tailored to what type of engines on there and what's the operating environment like. So, but generally speaking, as the engine turns, it's going to have a pump on there, and it's going to pull fuel onto itself, and that's going to be the primary means of fuel locomotion through those lines. Now, every aircraft that I can think of, at least maybe not like a G3 Cub, but even then I think that those have largely been retrofitted to have electric fuel pumps on it as well. And those fuel pumps come in a wide variety, and we're going to get to them here in just a second. But let's for a minute, let's just stick with the engine-driven fuel pumps. Now they're going to basically fall into two camps. One is the non-constant displacement, and two is the non-positive displacement. Okay, so what does that mean? All right, let's start by just trying to understand our basic pump types. So a non-positive displacement pump has a continuous flow. That's the main takeaway from this. But essentially, the way it works is like an impeller on a boat. You're going to have like this like windmill-like thing turning. It's going to pull fluid in because of the vacuum it creates as it moves fluid in the separate chambers. So if you imagine the inlet right there is going to be exposed to one of those impeller blades. Now, as that impeller blade comes around, it's going to basically grab whatever fluid's sitting there at the front, and then it's going to sequester it off against the case, leaving like a little bit of a vacuum right there. Well, that little bit of a vacuum will cause the rest of the fluid to rush into that blank space, which is then followed up by the next impeller blade. Now, that little chamber of fluid gets moved around up against the case and then gets dumped in the outlet as it goes, because there's going to be positive pressure inside of that little chamber, and then there's going to be negative pressure on the outlet. And this is happening so fast that whenever you look at it, it looks like it's just a steady stream. And this is actually a pretty common type pump. Your water pumps on your cars and all this other kind of stuff. That's generally how they work. And then so this is like half of the engine fuel pumps that are out there. This is how they operate. Okay, and then for a positive displacement pump or a non-constant displacement pump, the main thing to take away from this is that as the RPMs increase, the displacement of fluid will decrease, meaning that the more RPMs that you have, the more fuel that you get, which is really, really important because as the engine starts to rev up, it's going to want to consume more and more fuel. As it consumes more and more fuel, it needs more and more fuel, and it's also producing more power to cause it to run faster. And so, therefore, you need some sort of fuel pump to be able to keep up with it. A constant or a non-constant displacement or a positive displacement pump will is able to do that. As the pump starts to slow down, it doesn't move nearly as much fuel, but as it starts to rev up and starts to move faster, it's capable of moving more and more and more fuel, which allows for you to scale appropriately to keep the fluid or the fuel going in the engine to keep it going. So those are your two main kinds of engine driven pumps. Now let's look at some electric fuel pumps that are pretty common. Okay, in general aviation, this is a really common type of fuel pump that you'll see. It's almost always on the front of the firewall on like the left hand side of most pipers. Whenever you key it and turn it on, you'll hear it kind of make this like it sounds like a pump inside the cockpit. It goes like and but essentially it's just pressurizing the fuel in the line leading up to the engine, so that way the engine always has positive pressure, so that fuel pump doesn't have to work nearly as hard. These are really, really common. You'll see them all the time. I've actually never seen one go out. Doesn't mean that they can't go out. They haven't gone out, but it's like I've never personally seen one go out. I've seen them work for it seems like forever and a day. So they're fairly reliable. All right, as you kind of go up in complexity, you'll end up having sump pumps or boost pumps. This is like a boost pump that is the type that comes off of a Bell 206 or an OH58. Essentially, the body of the pump will sit into the fuel cell. So if you look at on the far left hand side where there's like a cannon plug and some safety wire and that kind of thing, that's actually on the outside of the fuel cell, and that's how you get it on, get it off, hook it up, and everything else. The rest of this goes up into the fuel line or into the fuel cell. So like this sits inside your fuel tank, and what happens is it basically stirs the tank. It just keeps the fuel constantly moving, and where there's on the kind of attached to the fuel cell will be an inlet line. Now, because of that whirling of the fuel, it pressurizes that line and pushes fuel down the line. Just like you would with a like an impeller style pump, it's the same concept, except for instead of having just the pump, it has it's you're moving the entire fuel tank around, and then the outlet there is a lot smaller, so you get lower pressures than you would say like just an impeller driven pump, but it does keep positive flow going through the lines and up into the fuel system. So typically you're going to end up having other fuel pumps along the way, but this is what gets it from the fuel cell up into the engine, and then the engine is going to have a internally driven pump that's going to grab that fuel and move it forward, creating a negative space for this fuel pump to then pressurize and push it in there. And so these are two examples of fuel pumps. Now, if you keep on pulling it apart, there's even bigger, more complex types of fuel pumps. All right, and this is a fuel pump off our 737 Max. You notice that it's a lot more complex. The pump side is you have two major inlets and then a little bleeder valve on the very bottom, and then the actual motor for the pump itself is that black thing on the right side. It is itself fairly hefty. But it does effectively the same thing. It's going to move fuel from the fuel tank and then push it through the lines up to where the engines are at. And in a 37, you can move fuel from one side to the other, from the center tank to the wings in back to the center tank, so on and so forth, and move it around. And that's pretty common with most jets that are going a long ways, have a lot of fuel, and you have weight and balance concerns as well as not wanting to leave empty space in there, because when you leave empty space, fumes form, and that's basically like a flying bomb. That's how TWA Flight 800 met its end. Is that there was back in those days they would drain the fuselage tank first and then go to the wings, and what that effectively did was right underneath the cabin. They left a big open chasm of where fuel used to be because the engines are burning fuel as it flies along, and they keyed an HF radio to make their standard like hourly call in. And when they did that, there was a short, and that short caused a spark, which then let those fumes off. Not too unlike the Apollo 13 shenanigans. They're strangely similar in a lot of ways. And so whenever that lit off, it literally blew up and caused a flash that could be seen for several miles. There was another 747 passing it like 6 or 7 miles off of its wing, and they called into ATC and said that they had seen an explosion, and that's what that was from. But all that being said is that there's a lot of fuel on these bigger airplanes, and it has to get managed appropriately. And the way that they manage it is via fuel pumps and fuel lines, just like we're learning about here now.
Now, at some point, we're going to have to make a decision of where that fuel needs to go. It's going to have one or two options. It's going to go to engine A, engine B, or wherever. Or it could be the opposite, that there's one engine, but there's two fuel cells that are feeding it. And so we need something to stand in the middle to help kind of direct traffic, and that's our fuel valve. Now, fuel valves are really common. You'll see them across all airframes. My airplane, my simple little Piper Cherokee, even has a fuel valve in it, but it's manually operated that you turn and twist with your hand. So let's talk about fuel valves.
Okay, so this is probably one of the simplest fuel valves you'll ever see. On the right hand side, there's a big red knob, and that's for selecting which tank the fuel is going to come from. Now, on early models of the Piper Cherokee, you had two options. You could take fuel from the left tank, or you could take fuel from the right tank. Later on, there was a third option where you could actually put it on both, and it would pull from both tanks equally, and that would keep you from having to swap tanks every so often. But this is a pretty straightforward, pretty basic fuel valve. It's just to select which tank it comes from, and that's all any valve really effectively is doing is just simply just selecting where the fuel is coming from and where the fuel is going. It's kind of like you remember the Looney Tunes, how the Coyote was always trying to flip the tracks on the train to make it go a certain way to run over the road runner or whatever. That's all a fuel valve effectively is. It doesn't really matter if it's something really really simple or something really really complex. Now let's look at a really simple one. Let's look at probably the more complex fuel valves. Okay, so this is a fuel shutoff valve on a 737. These are pretty straightforward. So if you look up there, the big purple, placarded thing that's on top, that's the motor that actually drives it. Now the valve body, the actual valve itself, is on the very very bottom. It's the big metal case thing, and inside of there is just like the fuel selector valve we saw on the Piper Cherokee. There's like a body that has a hole through it, and then it can rotate so that way it completely seals off that flow, and then it can rotate again to open up to re-expose the hole and let fluid go through there. Now the what ends up happening is that like if you decide to shut the fuel valve, and there's I'll show you the panel here in just a second. You can basically turn the fuel off, turn the fuel on from one place to the other. So that with that switch configuration, you can move fuel around the airplane as needed for whatever your situation is, or just shut it off completely. Now this is actually one of my favorite things to actually play around with on a 737, because actually just about any Boeing aircraft, that fuel valve can be manually overridden and manually driven. So you can reach up there and grab that little metal handle that you see that's kind of in between the purple stuff and then the big fuel body on the bottom where it's bolted. The actual fuel valve motor is bolted down. That motor moves back and forth, and it lets you know if it's open or closed. So you say like open position is 1. It's clearly denoted on this graphic here. So those valves are open, and if they were closed, it'd be a swing over on the 2. Well, you can close that valve, or you can force it open if need be. I had an old 737 one time that had a stuck fuel valve, and I remember I reached up in there and just forced it open and allowed gas to actually get the engine to fire off. And once it got going, you could let it go, and it wanted to drive back, but that was okay because we could run it off of different fuel cells at the time. Anyways, These are actually pretty cool to watch operate. So you can have guys flipping switches up in the cockpit, and you can see those little arms going back and forth, or you can drive them manually. And they tend to have issues. Like for whatever reason, these little guys will go bad. It's not that big of a deal to fix. They just come out. And it has like a little spline gear on the end of it. You just put a new one on and go about your day. Obviously, with a lot of paperwork because we're talking about like 121 aircraft, but that's probably about as complex as the fuel valve is going to effectively end up getting.
Okay, so the other thing that you will see pretty commonly across most airframes, some airframes don't have it, is a fuel filter. What do we need to know about fuel filters, and how do we capture anything that's floating around in the fuel, and what could potential contaminants look like? So let's talk about fuel filters.
Okay, so this is a gascolator. Gascolator is kind of like an early day elementless fuel filter. So the primary contaminant in fuel will always be water. Now, there's other stuff that can get into it and that we have to deal with, but generally speaking, water is the primary thing that causes us a bunch of issues, a bunch of problems. And so you need a place to capture that water. The easiest way to do this is have fuel come in, let it sit in a low spot, and then pull the fuel out of it. Because what will end up happening is the water is heavier than the fuel. The water will sink to the very bottom, and then you can press up on a release valve, and it'll fall out. And that's what you're doing whenever you're sumping the tanks. That's where the word sumping comes from, because generally speaking, all the water will go to the sump, and then you just open up the valve and let the water out. Now, the gascolator was one of the earliest ways to get that done, and it's still widely used. Most GA planes will have fuel tank sumps that allow for water and trash and stuff to come out to that sump on a regular basis, as well as a gascolator that's on the forward side of the firewall that before it's kind of like a last ditch effort to get any contaminants out before it actually goes into the engine. A lot of GA planes that have that don't necessarily have fuel filters. They might have a fuel screen going into the carburetor that's also kind of like a last ditch effort to catch anything that goes into it, at the last possible second. But for the most part, they won't have fuel filters per se, like in terms of filters like you might be thinking. When an aircraft does have a fuel filter, this is what it's going to generally look like. You're going to have a filter bowl, and we'll put one of those up here in just a second. And then inside of that filter bowl will be a filter element. What will happen is fuel will come on the will fill in the filter bowl from on the outside, and then fuel will get pulled through that filter element into the inner workings of the fuel filter, and then pumped up into wherever it's going. Now, a lot of times these are really super tight filters. They'll be down to like 10 microns. And so if you think about like, I think it's like 100 microns is the width of a hair, 10 microns is like, 1/10 of the width of your hair. So it's capturing a lot. Just about anything that may be in the filter can get caught up or get caught up in that filter element. Now, so with that, like you generally speaking will very rarely change these things out. You might, depending on the type of engine and what the maintenance manual calls for, you may do it at every 100 hour. But generally speaking, you're not going to have to deal with these fuel filters that much unless there's some kind of massive contamination that happens. And generally speaking, aviation fuel is treated like in like a sterile environment. One of the things that will happen if you have a small airplane crash at your airport, they'll shut the fuel off because one of the first things, the easiest things to mitigate is that was there bad fuel, yes or no. And so like they'll go test the fuel, see if there's any contaminants in it, any water, anything, any microbes, or anything that could potentially cause an engine to be disrupted. And once they've mitigated that, then they'll turn around and turn it back on. The fuel system, generally speaking, will be sequestered if a company is using a fuel tank. The only fuel that can come and go from their tanks, or like the only fuel that they have possession of is what goes in their aircraft, unless they're off airport or something like that. And so it's just treated totally different than it would say like your car, or your boat, or your lawnmower or something. There's a lower likelihood all around of getting any contaminants into that fuel to begin with, and then even whenever it's in the aircraft, you're going to go through a filtration system. You're going to go through a sump system in the tank, a filtration system once it gets to the engine, if not another sump in between those two, and then you're going to have screens on the carburetor, and so there's multiple chances for anything to get caught. It'll will be caught by one of those systems. Okay, so this is a filter bowl, and so the like your fuel filter element will slide into that filter bowl, and you can see how the fuel will come in, into it from either direction, and then it will come out of that filter element into the line and back into the rest of the system there. And that's how a fuel filter system works. Sometimes you'll end up having a bypass button that's on the top. This is definitely a thing in hydraulics. I have seen it on fuel systems, but they're fairly rare for a wide variety of reasons. But you could have a bypass button that pops up on top, and what that will do is that if the pressure inside of the bowl gets too much, there's a little valve that will open, and when that to help bypass the fuel filter. So that way, like if you're flying and your fuel filter gets clogged up, it won't starve your engine out. Like they would rather just take in dirty fuel than having no fuel at all. And so that bypass button will pop. It'll be like a little red button on the top to let you know. You'll also get an indication in the cockpit because it's a pretty big deal if the fuel filter bypass happens. And you'll be able to say like, hey, look, there's something really wrong with our fuel. It's causing the filter to get clogged up. Our engine's probably not too much longer for a life, and so we need to get on the ground quick. And that's the whole idea of that bypass button, just to turn around and buy the pilots a few extra minutes to get to a safe place, so that way they can shut the engine down and figure out what's going on.
Okay, lastly, and very uniquely, is a fuel heater. Now, you would think, why in the world would you need a fuel heater? But if you think about like the JT9 that's like right beside of me, it's used to operating at 45,000 feet, doing 500-600 miles an hour. Think about the level of cold that happens there. If there's any moisture whatsoever inside of that fuel, it's going to want to turn around and freeze it up like a big ice block. And then on top of that, the temperature of the fuel itself isn't going to lend itself to really good combustion. So we have to have some way to heat it. So let's talk about fuel heaters.
A fuel heater is going to be unique to your heavy commercial aircraft. You're not going to see a fuel heater in just about anything else. And the reason being is that, generally speaking, the fuel is not going to it's not going to be at risk of having ice start to form inside of it. But that being said, like whenever fuel tanks in an aircraft can cool below 32 degrees, any residual water that may be in there will freeze and form crystals. Now, when these ice crystals in the fuel become trapped in the filter, they basically clog the filter up, and then you have a pretty big issue on your hands. So by warming the fuel, you can help mitigate that issue. You also help improve combustion because fuel that's like too cold or too hot won't atomize correctly, and therefore they won't burn very well. Okay, the way that the fuel heater works is simply just a heat exchanger. It's going to take bleed air, regulate it down to an optimal temperature, heats the air baffles that are in there, and then let the fuel run past it. And then what that's going to do is going to pull the heat out of the fins and into the fuel, raising the temperature of the fuel up. As it does that, it will help mitigate the problem of any ice crystals forming inside of the fuel itself.
All right, now that we understand the parts and components, the next thing that we need to do is kind of build a theory of operation of how does a fuel system work, because that's going to be more or less the same wherever you go. There's going to be different levels of complexity and different components to it, but generally speaking, they all turn around and they take fuel from some other source, put it into a fuel tank, pipe it up to the engine, carburate it, combust it, and exhaust it, and then it goes on about your merry way. So if you can understand that, you can understand just about every single fuel system that's out there once you've learned the particulars.
Okay, so the best way to learn how the fuel system works as just as a corporate whole is to simply just take a fuel system and start picking it apart and trying to learn how does it integrate. And once you learn one, you've effectively learned them all. And so we're actually going to start with the 737 Max, since that's kind of our chosen airframe for stuff like this. And we're just going to slowly go through every little part and piece of it. Now, keep in mind the elements of this fuel system is going to carry across all fuel systems, but this one in particular might be a little bit more complex than just about every other aircraft that's out there. The only ones that are probably going to beat it in complexity are going to be your twin aisle your airplanes, like your 777s, your 87s, 47s, that kind of thing. All right. So first off, notice there's a couple of main fuel tanks. You have fuel tank 2 and 1 in the wings, and then you have a center tank there. Now, what I was telling you about TWA Flight 800, that's because they would drain that center tank first, and then they would go to the wings. Well, now they prioritize the wings first, and then they drain the center tank as you go on. That was like one of the big things that came out of that crash, is that was a procedure that they would just implement across the fleet, along with EWIS, so the electrical wiring interconnect system cleaning. So you have EWIS checks at different, depending on the way the airplane's maintained, but like your different A checks, B checks, C checks, so on and so forth. All right, so the other one to notice is that there's surge tanks. Now, here's the thing: is that with fuel needs to be vented, or else it'll vapor lock. Well, whenever, let's say you had this airplane and you filled it all the way up, and then it got hot, it's going to want to off gas and vent all of the system. When that happens, a lot of times fuel will come over or out the vents. Or if the airplane is taxiing and it gets on a little bit of a slant and it's got fuel tanks or full tanks, it'll go over and want to vent and go overboard. And this is a really common thing that you'll see with like fully fueled planes. As a matter of fact, I fueled a Glass Air not too long ago and had this exact problem. It was like leaking fuel all over the place. Well, to prevent that from happening, because keep in mind the 737 is purpose built for regional jet operations, to be able to move people from like one airport to the other in a big congested very tightly regulated, very busy spot. That's just not acceptable. You can't just have fuel going on. Imagine if you were at DFW and all those planes were just leaking fuel all over the place. It would be a safety nightmare. And so in order to compensate for that, they have what's called surge tanks. They're fuel tanks on the very end. So if that fuel goes to go overboard, it's going to go into the surge tank and then drain back into the main tanks right there. So that's how the 737 Max's fuel tank system works. All right, so the fuel quantity system is going to be a little bit more complex than your average aircraft. For a couple different reasons. One, there's a lot of space that you have to attribute or account for with fuel quantity, and the way that we're going to do this is with these capacitance units that we call compensators. And those compensators are going to be set up in the various fuel tanks, and they're going to take readings from the tank units. And these tank units, there are going to be several of them spread across all of the different fuel cells, and they're going to read how much fuel is in that tank. And keep in mind, using capacitance, like we've talked about before, we're going to get the weight of the fuel, not the gallons of the fuel per se. And so the plane's going to say like, okay, hey, look, we have like so many pounds of fuel, and we know that we're burning so many an hour. So the plane kind of gets an idea of what its range is. We're going to do that through capacitance, just like with a battery. Like if a battery is fully serviced with its electrolyte, it can hold a large amount of power. And then as that electrolyte starts to go down, it can hold less and less power. Effectively, we're doing the same thing, but instead of trying to get it to hold power, we're just simply trying to figure out how much can the battery hold, like based on the level of electrolyte. And that's how capacitance fuel system is effectively going to work. It's going to then feed to the FQIS unit. So that fuel quantity processing unit is going to turn around and do all the math it needs to do, and then it's going to have an ARINC 429 data bus that it goes to the flight management computer. It's going to say like, hey, look, this is how much fuel I know that I have, and I'm going to push this information out on a uniform system. In this case, it's ARINC 429, so that everything can talk to each other and they can synthesize that data, and then it's going to go to the FMS. And so the FMS is going to take it, then make certain decisions and certain recommendations to the pilot via the DPCs. The DPCs we're going to push up to the pilots. The pilots will make their decisions on if they need fuel or they need to fly further or faster or shut something down or whatever. The other two things that we're going to look at is one, the fuel control panel. That's where we're going to command pumps to come on. We're going to command valves to close and that kind of thing from the cockpit. Now, this is something that you'll actually interact with if you're a line guy fairly often, because you'll be taking on fuel. You might be troubleshooting fuel systems, that kind of thing. So this is something that you want to get familiar with, that P5 panel on the left-hand side there. The other one is the P15 panel, which is the refueling panel that's actually out on the fuselage. So if you go to fuel an aircraft, you're going to go out there, you're going to lift this little cover up, and you're going to have this P15 panel, and then you're going to program it and say like, hey, look, we need so much fuel here, so much fuel there, and then you'll go through the fueling procedures per the AMM to suck it up on there. But that's how you actually understand how much is in the tank, and then then you can turn around and make decisions on all that on the other side. So that is the 737's like FQIS system, and how the system interfaces with the human element as well. Now, if you had like a Piper Cherokee, it's not going to be near this sophisticated. You're going to have little float valves in there that's going to tell you, hey, about how much you have. You'll rock the wings and you'll see the fuel gauges turn. If you have a J3 Cub, it's like a little suction glass that just shows you like the level that it's at. You kind of like make your decisions based on that. Generally speaking, it's really good to always have a timer going and how long the engine's been running. So then you can kind of make some mental math and understand like it should be about here, and if your fuel indication is like way off and it's not that at all, then you know that there's something that's gone awry. You need to make a change on your operations before you run out of gas, or you overfill it and then you try to make a short field takeoff and you can't make it because there's too much gas on board, which is another kind of unique. You can have too much gas on these aircraft. Now, the only other thing on this to really talk about is there's a fuel measuring stick on there, and this is a pretty neat kind of thing just because it's so rudimentary. It's literally just like a little wooden stick that pops down, or it's fiberglass, and you go up there and you push on it, it comes down, and it has a float on the other end of it, and it will float to wherever the top level of the fuel's at. So if your FQIS system is saying like, hey, look, we don't have any gas, and you're like, I know there's plenty of gas in there, you can go up there to the measuring stick, push on it, and it comes down, and now you know you have an electrical problem that you need to fix, or vice versa. But that's something that's fairly standard in most of these bigger airplanes that you need to get comfortable, dealing with. All right, so this is just another look at that P15 panel. You have, you just start taking from the top to the left. You're going to see the basic panel there, and then the panel that has pre-select set up on there, so that way you can take on so much gas. Eventually, it'll take on so much, then it'll shut it off, so that way you can't overfuel it. So if the pilot says, "Hey, look, we need 1,000 pounds on the right wing," you program it so that way you get that 1,000 pounds, and basically it'll quit taking on fuel whenever it's at that level. You can see that it's located right there on the right wing. There's some float switches that are involved. Nothing that's really too super duper complicated. However, one thing I do want to point out is that power for the refuel system comes from the battery bus, the hot battery bus, and the external power through the BPCU transformer rectifier. All right, so that the reason why I bring that up is that you start to see how these systems start to getting integrated. Now, as this system gets integrated, if you have a problem with, say, like your BPCU, which touches just about everything, you can start throwing off all kinds of things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a hard failure. It could be simply that the BPCU, for whatever reason, is putting off too much or too little, or some sort of power that's like out of sync, or something that is just slightly off. And then if it's slightly off, it's going to throw all these problems that may manifest as something totally different. So I've seen situations where guys are like, oh, well, like the P15's wrong, and they change out this whole panel just to come back and have the exact same issue again, because they didn't fundamentally understand what was wrong at the very beginning, and they did what we called loading the parts cannon. So they thought like, oh, well, this thing's broke, it must be right here, so let's just replace this component. And that's not the way to be. The way to be is to understand the problem first and then make your decision. All right, so this is the fuel feed system for the 737 MAX. The one thing I want you to look at is look how the valves and the pumps are integrated to create the right pathway for the fuel to move from one place to the next. Also look at that there are engine valves or engine pumps as well. So those engine pumps are pulling on fuel to try to get it to come. You have to enable the fuel by opening up those fuel spar valves, let it flow through there, and then behind that is a litany of different boost pumps and shutoff valves that and crossfeed valves that will allow fuel to go from one way to the other way as needed. So that way you could have an engine out on like engine two goes out and but you still have a full bag of gas to get where you're going. So that way you can then turn around and say, hey, look, we're not going to send fuel to engine two anymore. All the fuel is going to go to engine one. So you can say you start pulling off the right wing and then just move it slowly across into your number one engine off on the left hand side there. And that's the way that we do that is through boost pumps and cross feed valves. Now, if you're going to actually go work on this, one of the best things I can recommend you to do when you're working on systems like this that have a certain level of complexity to it is go into the systems maintenance manual that's in here and start just studying what does right look like. What is it supposed to do? If you understand what it's supposed to do, and then you can understand what the plane is trying to command things to do. It's trying to open valves. It's trying to turn pumps on or off based on what you're telling it to do. Then you can kind of start to interpolate what could potentially be going on. If you're supposed to be getting fuel at the engine number or engine number two, and it's not getting there, where you can say what's my fuel spar valve doing? Is it open or closed? Or what's my pump? Is it on or is it off? Is there a fuel filter somewhere in here that's clogged or whatever? And you can kind of work your way back there. But you have to be able to understand two things. One, you have to understand these components and how they work and how what will trip them up. Like pumps will get burnt out for different reasons, or our valves will get stuck, or they won't be commanded appropriately. They'll be inhibited, and so you need to integrate your knowledge of the electrical system and how to troubleshoot the plug. Is like if are you getting a signal there to open that valve? Yes or no. Is there ground good? Yes or no. And then simultaneously, you need to understand how the system starts to work together and understand the state the plane is in, and then start to think through it as if you were the plane. If I wanted my fuel to come out to engine number one, I need these things to happen. And what are those types of things that could prevent that from happening? Which could be anything from bad switchology to some sort of emergency situation that the plane thinks it's in, that somebody could have bumped something, hit something, or there could be a failure somewhere else and the plane is now shutting off all the fuel valves. There's any number of things that could cause this system to basically just lock up and not move, because the basic kind of response to a lot of different emergencies is to shut the fuel off, because if they shut the fuel off, they keep it contained in the fuel cells. You don't have to worry about fuel going to places it shouldn't, that it could then catch on fire. All right, so this is a little bit more higher fidelity look at those different fuel pumps that could be in there, specifically in the scavenge system. Now, the fuel scavenge system removes the remaining fuel in the center tank and then transfers it to main tank one, and this helps increase the usable fuel quantity in the center tank. So eventually, the center tank, especially those long hauls, is going to get to a point where it can't suck up enough fuel anymore. So the scavenge system cuts on and then starts moving fuel over into the main tank. So that way you don't have to worry about trying to transfer it or anything. It's just going to happen, automatically there. And so if you end up having a problem with the scavenge system, this is what you could potentially be looking at. Now look at this. These different. You have a boost pump, a scavenge pump, center tank pumps, water scavenge pumps. So what's a water scavenge system? The water scavenge system removes water from the low point. So instead of sumping the tanks, it's going to scavenge it and then collect it and get it out of there. But you can just see how there's so many different pumps to move all of that fuel around in different modes of flight and different phases of operation. And I won't put it up there, but there's also a defuel system as well that has its own complexity to it. That if you need to take fuel off of the plane for any reason, be it in flight or elsewhere, there's ways to do that. And so, one of the main things that you'll do, we'll eventually have an operation out here that will require these aircraft to not be fueled anymore, and so in order they'll land the plane and they're going to say like, hey, look, fuel has to come off this plane somehow, and the let's go take the the fuel petcock out and let it just drain into a 5 gallon bucket trick doesn't work anymore because there's so much fuel. And so what you're going to have is a way to defuel the plane. There's actually a defuel valve with pumps and everything else that moves the fuel out of the plane. All right, so I wanted to put this up there so that way you can kind of get eyes on of what one of the primary interfaces you are with the fuel system as an aircraft mechanic. This is the fuel control panel in a 737. It doesn't matter if Max, NG, or whatever; they're all virtually about the same. And what you'll notice here is that there's a crossfeed valve command. That's a big rotary knob right there, and you see the line, the black line that is vertical right now. Well, in order to turn the crossfeed on, you have to rotate it about 45 degrees, so that way it is horizontal, or I guess 90 degrees, so that way it's horizontal, and that will basically open the crossfeed valve. You also have the main fuel pumps to turn things on or off, and then you have forward and aft 1 and 2 fuel pumps as well that you can move fuel around as needed. Now that line, that white line, or I guess it's a black line with white outsides, shows you how fuel could potentially move. So if you needed, fuel to go from the number one fuel cell to the number two fuel cell, but you needed to come from the aft to go to the forward, you can kind of think through how you would go through and do that. You also have your filter bypass valves. That are right there that will illuminate and say, hey, look, we're bypassing the fuel filter, which means there's some sort of contaminant there that we need to take care of. You have a litany of low pressure lights. So if you have low pressure in any one of those things, that will tell you. Which if we think through what we know about fuel pressure, any sort of low pressure basically indicates there's no fuel there for the most part. The other ones to take into consideration are those blue lights up there. Now those blue lights will illuminate if there is a certain condition. So if the spar valve closes, the light will come on. If it's not illuminated, then you know that the spar valve is open in theory, and you can always push on it and test and make sure that the light bulb actually works. So if you see it's dim, but you expect that one of the valves are closed or open, then you can go up there and push on it and then make sure that the light illuminates. You're like, okay, cool. Like I would know if it closed because then I know that light works. And that's kind of the way that the fuel panel works. But other than that, that's been like kind of an overview of fuel systems. Look forward to seeing you in class.